In 1952, a Pond's cold cream advertisement ran in nearly every major women's magazine in America, and it featured not a model, not a starlet, but a society wife, white-gloved, pearl-clasped, pressing a folded tissue to her porcelain cheek with the practiced serenity of someone performing a sacred rite. The tagline read simply, "She still has her schoolgirl complexion." Beneath those 6 words lay one of the most powerful commercial mythologies of the entire post-war era, the belief, urgent and deeply gendered, that a woman's skin was a project, a responsibility, a testament to her discipline, and the tool she was expected to wield every single night, without fail, without excuse. In the blue-lit privacy of her vanity alcove was cold cream. It sounds simple, it was anything but. The cold cream ritual of the 1950s was not a casual swipe before bed. It was a choreographed, multi-step procedure, and it governed the nightly hours of millions of American women from housewives in Akron to socialites in Bel Air. Understanding why requires understanding both the industrial chemistry and the social contract that built the mid-century beauty world. The post-war American woman had been handed a new standard, luminous, dewy, impossibly smooth, and the cosmetics industry, now flush with wartime manufacturing efficiency and peacetime consumer hunger, was perfectly positioned to sell her the means to chase it. Cold cream itself was not a new invention. Its origins stretch back to the 2nd century, when the Greek physician Galen first described a mixture of beeswax, olive oil, rosewater, and borax. By the late 19th century, European and American cosmetic houses had reformulated the concept into a thick, waxy emulsion sold in heavy glass pots. Pond's, founded in 1846 by Theron Pond in Utica, New York, had been selling cold cream since the 1890s. But it was the post-war decade that transformed cold cream from a modest grooming product into a nightly cornerstone of American femininity. What made cold cream so effective and so culturally entrenched was its dual action. The mineral oil and wax-based dissolved theatrical makeup, grease paint, and the heavy foundations women wore throughout the day, lifting pigment and powder from the skin's surface without the harsh stripping effect of early soap and water cleansing. Then, the water and oil emulsion left a residual film on the skin, providing what was marketed as overnight nourishment. Women in the 1950s wore considerably more makeup than their modern counterparts. Full foundation, pressed powder, rouge, liquid liner, mascara, and lipstick were the standard daytime face, and removing all of that without damaging the underlying skin required something with serious dissolving power. Cold cream delivered. Pond's alone sold millions of units annually through the 1950s, and their advertising strategy was a masterclass in aspirational social positioning. The campaign known as "She's Engaged, She's Lovely, She Uses Pond's" had been running since the 1930s and continued well into the 50s, featuring genuine debutantes and socialites rather than professional models. The implication was pointed and deliberate. Women who used Pond's cold cream were the kind of women who became engaged to appropriate men, who moved in the right circles, whose complexions were proof of their careful self-governance. Skin was character. Cold cream was the practice. Woodbury was Pond's closest rival in the cold cream sweepstakes, and their formulations competed head-to-head on pharmacy shelves throughout the decade. Woodbury's facial cream, which had reformulated heavily in the late 40s to capitalize on new emulsification technology, positioned itself as the more scientific option. The advertising copy leaned heavily on dermatological language, invoking pore structures and pH balance in terms that sounded authoritative without quite being medical. Both brands understood that the 50s woman trusted science. The atomic age had delivered nuclear energy, synthetic fabrics, and antibiotics. Surely it could deliver a perfect complexion. The cosmetics industry was delighted to borrow that cultural authority. The actual nightly ritual was a full ceremony. It began not with the cold cream itself, but with the preparation of the face, specifically with removing the day's lipstick using a separate petroleum-based lip cleaner, since lipstick pigments in the 1950s were exceptionally tenacious, built on dye lakes and waxes designed to last from morning coffee to evening cocktails. Then came the first application of cold cream, not a thin smear but a generous two-fingered scoop from the pot, pressed into the forehead, both cheeks, and the chin, then worked outward in the prescribed upward and outward strokes. Every beauty columnist in every magazine emphasized direction with evangelical urgency. Never downward, never circular, always upward, always outward, always with the grain of the aging process rather than against it. The first pass was blotted away with cotton wool, not tissue which could drag, and with it came the day's foundation, powder, and rouge, landing in soft terracotta smears on the white cotton. Then came a second, lighter application, this time worked into the eye area with the ring finger only, that finger being the weakest digit and therefore safest for the delicate orbital tissue. Then tissue removal, not cotton, for the second pass. And here a specific technique was taught in beauty columns and finishing schools alike. Fold the tissue once, place the folded edge beneath one eye, press gently inward, and draw the tissue outward across the lid in a single motion, lifting mascara flake and cream together without rubbing. Then, finally, the night cream, a different product entirely from the cold cream, though they were often confused in popular shorthand. Night cream was thicker, richer, more occlusive. Brands like Germaine Montet, Helena Rubinstein, and Elizabeth Arden sold their night cream lines as prestige items, packaged in frosted glass jars with gold lettering, positioned not on pharmacy shelves but at department store counters where a white-coated beauty consultant could administer both the product and the social reinforcement of its necessity. The night cream sealed everything in, creating what Arden's marketing described as an overnight beauty mask. The skin restored, the day's urban pollution defended against, the aging process briefly suspended. Urban pollution was not a trivial concern in 1950s America. The post-war industrial boom had coated American cities in a permanent haze of coal smoke, automobile exhaust, and factory particulate. Women living in cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, or Los Angeles understood viscerally that the air itself was hostile to their skin. Cold cream, in this context, was not merely cosmetic. It was a form of environmental remediation, a nightly decontamination ritual that removed not only makeup but the actual physical residue of industrial civilization. The skin was being defended. The city was being held at bay. By the end of the decade, the cold cream ritual had evolved in response to new product categories entering the market. Cleansing milks, formulated to be slightly more fluid and less occlusive than traditional cold cream, began appearing from European houses like Lancôme and Orlan, positioning themselves as the sophisticated continental alternative. American brands responded with their own lighter formulations, but the cold cream pot, heavy, waxy, potently perfumed, remained the foundation of the ritual for the majority of American women throughout the 50s. It was in their mothers' medicine cabinets. It was what the beauty editors recommended. It was what the Pond's ads insisted made you the kind of woman someone wanted to marry. Looking back at the cold cream culture of the 1950s from the vantage of the present, two things become immediately clear. The first is that the chemistry was not entirely wrong. Mineral oil and wax-based cleansers do remove makeup thoroughly and without stripping the skin's natural moisture barrier, and the basic formulation principle has survived into modern micellar water and cleansing balm technology. The second is that the cultural weight placed on the ritual was enormous, almost crushing in its implications. A woman who skipped her cold cream was not merely lazy. She was failing a test of character, neglecting the project of her own femininity, letting down a social contract written entirely around the appearance of her face. The cold cream pot on the vanity was never just a beauty product. It was a daily reminder of what the 50s expected women to be: meticulous, disciplined, and perpetually in the process of becoming more beautiful than they already were. The relationship between Pond's advertising strategy and the broader cultural politics of post-war femininity rewards particularly close examination. The brand's use of genuine socialites and debutantes rather than professional models was not merely a marketing choice. It was a philosophical statement about who the product was for and what it promised. By placing daughters of the American social register in its advertisements, Pond's was selling not merely a complexion product, but a kind of social legitimacy, an implicit claim that the women who used Pond's properly and consistently might expect to achieve or maintain the social position those women represented. This was the genius of the campaign. It operated simultaneously as aspiration and as instruction, telling women not merely that the product worked, but what success, defined in the most conventional possible terms, was supposed to look like. The countercultural implications of the cold cream ritual are equally worth examining. In a decade that placed enormous premium on feminine softness, on yielding, accommodating, non-threatening womanhood, The nightly cold cream ritual was one of the few domains where a woman was explicitly instructed to be methodical, rigorous, and technically precise. The beauty column instructions were not soft encouragements. They were technical specifications, and the women who followed them successfully were demonstrating competence of a kind that the rest of their social world rarely asked of them. There was something quietly subversive about the precision required. This was skill, and skill was satisfying in ways that went beyond the cosmetic results it produced. The economy surrounding cold cream and its attendant products was substantial and sophisticated. Drugstore shelves in 1952 carried not merely Pond's and Woodbury, but a hierarchy of products ranging from the economy, Jergens formulations at one end, to the Arden and Rubinstein preparations that required a department store visit and a willingness to spend several times the drugstore price at the other. The middle tier, which included brands like Noxzema, whose camphor and menthol formula had a medicinal quality that positioned it as slightly more therapeutic than purely cosmetic, was large and competitive. Women moved between these tiers according to their financial circumstances and social ambitions, trading down in economic difficulty and trading up when prosperity allowed. Cold cream was not a luxury, it was a necessity, and the range of price points reflected the social democracy of that necessity. The packaging of cold cream was itself an important cultural text. The Pond's jar, circular white ceramic effect glass with a white metal lid, and the elegant blue script lettering that had been the brand's visual identity since the early 20th century, was an object of considerable domestic familiarity, recognized in any American bathroom or vanity table without need of further identification. The heft of the jar, the specific resistance of the metal lid to opening, the initial cold white surface of the cream visible through the glass, these were sensory experiences deeply embedded in the domestic memory of the mid-century American woman. To open a Pond's jar in 1955 was to participate in an experience that connected her to her own mother's vanity table, and to a tradition of feminine self-care that felt ancient even when it was merely familiar. The vanity table itself, as a piece of furniture and a dedicated domestic space, warrants consideration as a cultural artifact of the first order. The mid-century vanity, typically a low table with a central mirror and flanking drawers, upholstered in a matching fabric to the bedroom suite, was the woman's primary private territory in a domestic world where most spaces were shared. Unlike the kitchen, which was her professional domain, but which was also the household's functional centre, the vanity was entirely personal. The drawers contained her cosmetics in the specific organisation she had devised. The mirror reflected only her face. The small padded stool was scaled for her alone. The cold cream ritual anchored this space as daily sacred ground, transforming a piece of furniture into something closer to an altar. On a Tuesday morning in 1953, Grace Kelly arrived at the MGM makeup department at 6:45 in the morning, sat in a padded chair beneath a bank of fluorescent lights, and submitted her face to a process that would take the next 90 minutes to complete. Her makeup artist, William Tuttle, who held the distinction of being MGM's head of makeup throughout the Golden Studio era, applied a pancake foundation 2 shades lighter than Kelly's natural skin tone, then built shadow, contour, and highlight with the precision of an architectural draftsman. The result was not Grace Kelly as she existed in the world. It was Grace Kelly as the camera would record her, as the screen would present her, as the mid-century American imagination would receive her. It was a constructed thing, and it was magnificent. 2 miles across Los Angeles at 20th Century Fox, a different kind of construction was underway. Marilyn Monroe, arriving characteristically late, settled into her own makeup chair with a studied languor that itself constituted a kind of performance. Alan Snyder, her personal makeup artist known to Monroe simply as Whitey, had developed over years of collaboration a specific facial architecture designed not for the cool, architectural perfection of a Kelly, but for an entirely different effect: warmth, softness, and almost aggressive vulnerability. Where Kelly's face was composed, Monroe's was yielding. Both were engineered with total deliberation by professionals working at the absolute peak of their craft. These 2 archetypes, and they were understood as archetypes, explicitly discussed in magazine profiles, beauty columns, and Hollywood trade publications throughout the decade, shaped the entire visual vocabulary of 1950s femininity in ways that reached far beyond the screen and into the bathrooms and vanity tables of ordinary American women. The matinee star was not merely entertainment. She was instruction. She was evidence of what a face could be made to mean. The 1950s was the final decade of the old Hollywood studio system's total command over image production, and that system had developed over 30 years a sophisticated industrial apparatus for creating female faces. Every major studio maintained a dedicated makeup department staffed by certified cosmeticians who had studied under guild contracts and who understood the technical demands of both orthochromatic and panchromatic film stock, then later of early Technicolor and CinemaScope. The chemistry of film emulsion dictated cosmetic choices. Certain pigments photographed as flat grey while others bloomed luminously, and the makeup artists of the studio system had mapped this territory with scientific thoroughness. Pancake Foundation, the brand Pancake, developed by Max Factor in 1937 specifically for Technicolor film, had by the 50s become the dominant product both on screen and off. Max Factor's Hollywood laboratories were genuinely sophisticated operations for their era, employing chemists alongside cosmeticians, and the company's dual positioning as both Hollywood supplier and mass-market retailer meant that the formulations developed for film quickly migrated to consumer shelves. When an ordinary woman in Dayton, Ohio purchased a Max Factor compact, she was buying a direct descendant of the same technology used to construct the faces she watched on Friday night screens. The aspiration was built into the packaging. But the real lesson of the matinee archetypes was not about specific products. It was about the understanding of the face as a structural problem to be solved, a set of proportions to be adjusted, emphasized, minimized, redirected. Hollywood makeup artists of the 1950s operated from a theoretical framework, imperfectly codified but widely shared, in which the ideal female face conformed to specific geometric ratios. The width of the eye should equal 1/5 the width of the face at eye level, the space between the eyes should equal one eye width, the ideal lip should occupy a specific proportion of the lower facial third. Most women's faces deviated from these ideals in some direction, and makeup was the instrument of correction. The techniques developed to achieve this correction were taught, discussed, and disseminated with genuine pedagogical seriousness. Helena Rubinstein, who had been teaching women to analyze their own facial architecture since the 1910s, ran beauty salons throughout the 50s, where consultants performed what Rubinstein called a face reading, a systematic assessment of the client's bone structure, skin tone, and feature proportions that produced a personalized makeup prescription. Elizabeth Arden's salons offered similar services. These were not soft-focus luxuries. They were technical consultations, and the women who sought them understood themselves to be investing in specialized knowledge. The influence of the two great archetypes, Kelly and Monroe, operated at the level of intent and emotional register rather than specific technique. The woman who identified with Kelly's archetype was reaching for composure, a face that conveyed controlled elegance, emotional restraint, the quiet authority of someone who had learned to curate every impression she made. Her makeup was precisely applied, harmonious, never discordant. Her skin appeared flawlessly matte. Her eyes were defined but not aggressive, her lips coloured but proportionate. She was aspirationally unreachable, and that unreachability was the point. The woman who identified with Monroe's archetype was reaching for something more dangerous and more democratically available. Softness as power, vulnerability as invitation. Monroe's makeup, examined technically, was actually extraordinarily complex. The famously arched brows, redrawn higher and more dramatically than her natural brows, the pale, almost iridescent foundation, the lip liner drawn fractionally outside the natural lip line to suggest fullness, the Vaseline-touched highlighter on the Cupid's bow that caught every light source in the room. None of this was accidental, and none of it was simple, but it produced an effect that read as artless, natural, inevitable. The artifice was perfectly hidden within the appearance of no artifice at all. American women throughout the decade navigated between these poles, sometimes choosing one register for daytime, another for evening, sometimes oscillating across the decade as fashion shifted its preference from Kelly's cool restraint in the early 50s toward a more Monroe-adjacent warmth by the decade's end. The beauty columns tracked this navigation with sociological attention. Vogue and Harper's Bazaar spoke to women who wanted the Kelly ideal. Photoplay and Modern Screen spoke to the Monroe aspirants. But both publications understood that they were not merely reporting on beauty trends. They were actively participating in the manufacture of the archetypes themselves. What made the matinee makeup culture of the 1950s genuinely significant, viewed from the distance of several decades, was the degree to which it democratized what had previously been specialized theatrical knowledge. The techniques of foundation color matching, contour shading, and eye shape correction that had been trade secrets of the makeup department became, through magazine tutorials, Revlon advertising, and the patient explanations of department store beauty counters, widely available to any woman willing to learn them. The face as construction project was no longer the exclusive province of the studio lighting director and the guild cosmetician. It was available to everyone. That availability was both liberation, the tools of transformation were in reach, and a new form of expectation, one that was arguably harder to escape than the simpler beauty standards that preceded it. The manufacturing infrastructure that supported the matinee makeup culture was genuinely industrial in scale by the 1950s. Max Factor's Hollywood facility, which had moved to a new purpose-built building on Highland Avenue in the late 1940s, employed hundreds of workers and operated essentially as a dual-purpose operation. One side of the organization supplied the working professional film industry with custom color-matched, camera-tested products, while the other side reverse-engineered those professional formulations into mass-market consumer lines. The efficiency of this arrangement was remarkable. It meant that Max Factor could legitimately claim Hollywood provenance for its consumer products, since the underlying chemistry was genuinely derived from the professional applications, and it meant that the brand's R&D costs were effectively subsidized by professional sales. The department store beauty counter, which was the primary retail environment for prestige cosmetics in the 1950s, was itself an important social institution whose design and operation reflected a sophisticated understanding of the aspirational dynamics of cosmetic consumption. The counter was positioned on the ground floor of every major department store, typically near the main entrance, so that the customer had to pass it on her way to any other department. The lighting over the counter was specifically designed to be flattering, slightly warmer and more directional than the general store lighting, so that a woman looking into the counter mirror saw herself at her best. The beauty consultants who staffed these counters were trained both in cosmetic technique and in the social management of the transaction. They knew how to make a customer feel that she was receiving personalized attention rather than a sales pitch, how to diagnose and address the customer's specific concerns without implying that those concerns were too severe to be solved, and how to introduce additional product categories without creating the impression of aggressive upselling. The skin tone challenge of mid-century foundation was a significant limitation that the era's marketing carefully avoided discussing directly. The foundation color range available at most counters served a narrow band of the population, specifically the range of European complexion types from fair Nordic to medium Mediterranean, and served that range with reasonable accuracy. Women whose complexions fell outside this range were simply not served by the mainstream market, and they managed with either adaptation of available products or with specialty lines that occupied a different retail geography entirely. This limitation, which would become a significant commercial and ethical issue for the industry beginning in the 1980s, was simply invisible in the mainstream beauty culture of the 50s. Invisible not because it did not exist, but because the women affected by it were invisible to the mainstream culture, producing the advertising and writing the beauty columns. The relationship between screen makeup and the light sources available for reading it represents one of the more technically interesting aspects of the matinee makeup culture. The makeup developed for Technicolor film, which had its own specific spectral sensitivity different from both black and white orthochromatic and panchromatic stocks, produced colours that could look quite extreme under normal daylight. The orangey foundation tone that made an actress look natural on screen could look frankly orange in a department store. Women who bought their cosmetics based primarily on screen reference rather than counter consultation sometimes had this experience, and the beauty advisor's role in translating between screen ideal and real-world application was a genuine and valued service. The specific training that Hollywood makeup artists received in the 1950s, and the institutional knowledge they carried, represents one of the great unwritten technical histories of the period. The union structure of the makeup artist trade, governed by Local 706 of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, preserved and transmitted this knowledge through a formal apprenticeship system that required years of supervised work before an artist could be certified as a journeyman. The certification examination included written and practical components that assessed knowledge of color theory, skin anatomy, prosthetic and corrective techniques, and period and character application. The men and women who passed this examination were, in the most precise sense, licensed professionals in a skilled trade whose expertise was as real as any medical technician's. The influence of the Hollywood makeup tradition on the amateur beauty culture of the 1950s was also mediated by a surprisingly robust how-to publishing industry that occupied the intersection of fandom and practical instruction. Books like Tippi Hedren's Unofficial Beauty Guides, the authorized beauty books published under various starlets' names, and the studio-produced fan club beauty bulletins all carried makeup instruction that was explicitly theatrical in origin, translated for the domestic reader. These publications taught concepts, color correction, structural contouring, lash-building technique that had been developed for the controlled environment of the soundstage and were being asked to perform in the unpredictable light conditions of ordinary life. That they worked as well as they did is evidence of both the robustness of the underlying technique and the dedication of the women who studied and practiced it. In 1954, a beauty editor at Mademoiselle magazine published a tutorial that would be reprinted, copied, paraphrased, and adapted for the next decade in virtually every women's publication in America. The tutorial was titled with period-perfect directness, The Trick of the Tilted Eye, and it walked its readers through the precise application of liquid eyeliner to create what it called the doe-eye extension, a thin, upswept flick at the outer corner of the upper lid that elongated the eye's apparent shape, lifted the outer corner, and produced an expression that read simultaneously as innocent and sophisticated, watchful and warm. The tutorial required, the author noted, a fine, absolutely dry brush, a steady wrist, and at least 3 practice sessions on the back of the hand before attempting the face. Those 3 practice sessions were not an exaggeration. Liquid eyeliner in the mid-1950s was a genuinely demanding technical instrument, and the women who wielded it with the casual fluency that fashion demanded had typically served an apprenticeship of weeks or months before their lines grew steady and reliable. The formulation itself was part of the challenge. Early liquid liners, which had entered the American mass market in the late 1940s, largely on the strength of theatrical and film industry adoption, were built on shellac or resin bases dissolved in alcohol, with carbon black or other dark pigments suspended in the solution. They dried fast, sometimes too fast, dragging the brush before the line was complete, and they were unforgiving of hesitation. A shaky wrist produced not a soft blur, as a pencil would have, but a hard, jagged record of every nervous tremor. Revlon entered the liquid liner market in the early 50s, with formulations that improved slightly on the theatrical originals, adding plasticizers to slow the drying time and improve flexibility of the dried film. A dried liner that was too brittle would crack when the eye moved, producing the dreaded spider leg effect along the lash line by mid-morning. Max Factor's liquid liner, marketed with the authority of Hollywood on its label, competed directly with Revlon's. Hazel Bishop, the cosmetic chemist who had revolutionized lipstick with her no-smear formula in 1950, turned her attention to liner formulation and produced improvements in adhesion and flexibility that were genuinely significant. The competition between these brands to perfect the formula was fierce, because the liner look was dominating beauty culture, and the brand that got the formula right would own an enormous market. The social symbolism of the defined eye in 1950s culture is not reducible to simple aesthetic preference. It connects directly to the cultural anxieties and aspirations of the era in ways that reward examination. The 50s were a period of intense social performance, particularly for women who were expected to navigate an expanding set of contradictory demands, to be seen but not aggressive, to attract attention but not invited inappropriately, to be visually compelling in a domestic context that demanded their energies be directed inward, toward home and family, rather than outward toward the world. The defined eye was a resolution of this contradiction, of a sort. It directed attention toward the face without making a claim on public space. It suggested intelligence and self-awareness without the social risk of verbal assertion. The specific geometry of the winged liner look was not arbitrary. The outward and upward flick at the eye's outer corner performed a specific optical function. It counteracted the natural downward pull of the outer canthal angle, which is associated visually with age, sadness, and fatigue. An eye with an upswept outer corner reads as younger, more alert, more positively engaged with the world. This was understood intuitively by the women who practiced the technique long before the neuroscience of facial perception was articulated as a formal discipline. They were doing applied psychology with a small synthetic brush and a pot of black shellac solution. The thickness of the liner line was itself a cultural text that shifted across the decade. In the early 1950s, particularly under the influence of the cool aristocratic aesthetic embodied by figures like Grace Kelly and the models photographed by Avedon for Harper's Bazaar, the liner line was thin and precise, a single clean stroke of no more than 1 millimeter in width, applied close to the lash root, the wing no longer than 3 or 4 millimeters. This restrained application said something specific: refinement, control, technical accomplishment. It was difficult to do well, and its difficulty was part of its social meaning. By the middle of the decade, as the influence of Italian cinema began to register in American fashion, particularly through the enormous American reception of the Cinecittà productions and the Roman holiday aesthetic associated with Audrey Hepburn, who had spent significant time in Italy and absorbed the continental eye makeup tradition, the liner line began to thicken and the wing to lengthen. The Italian liner tradition, drawing on theatrical and film makeup developed by the studios at Cinecittà, favoured a heavier hand. The result was an eye that was more dramatically defined, more overtly theatrical, more insistent on being seen. The doe-eye of the early 50s had been wide and innocent. The doe-eye of 1957 and 58 was wider and more knowing. The lash infrastructure that supported the liner was itself the subject of substantial technical development throughout the decade. False lashes, which had been used in Hollywood since the 1920s, began their penetration into the mass consumer market in the early 50s. Helena Rubinstein was among the first prestige brands to market consumer-grade false lashes with serious marketing investment, positioning them as the bridge between the theatrical look of the screen and the achievable ambition of the everyday woman. The adhesives available for domestic use were less sophisticated than the theatrical surgical adhesives used in studio makeup departments, which meant that DIY lash application was a skill with a genuine learning curve, and lash disasters, the wandering corner, the gap at the inner canthus, the lash that lifted during a matinee, were sufficiently common to generate their own genre of cautionary beauty column. Mascara, which predated liquid liner as a consumer product by several decades, underwent significant reformulation in the 50s to serve the new graphic eye aesthetic. Revlon's mascara lines, alongside those from Helena Rubinstein and Max Factor, shifted away from the cake mascara that required a wet brush and toward the cream mascara in a tube, with a brush applicator that was itself a technical innovation. The wand and spiral brush combination that remains the dominant mascara delivery system to the present day was developed and refined during precisely this period. The goal was to add length and thickness to the natural lash to support the effect of the liner, not to compete with it. Looking at the liner tutorials, advertisements, and beauty column discussions of the 1950s now, what stands out is not the technical specificity, but the sheer investment of time and practice they assumed their readers were willing to make. A modern consumer beauty culture built on the premise of ease, 12-second tutorials, foolproof applicators, beginner-friendly formulas, would find the 50s beauty culture almost alien in its expectation of acquired skill. The winged liner was not designed to be easy. It was designed to reward effort, to distinguish women who had taken the time to master it from those who had not. It was, in the most literal sense, a performance of discipline, and the quality of the wing told anyone who looked closely exactly how much effort the woman wearing it had considered worth making. The intersection of liquid liner technique with the burgeoning television industry added a new dimension to the mid-decade development of the look that has been underappreciated in subsequent histories of the period. Television cameras of the early 1950s, operating in black and white and with far less optical resolution than film, produced an image that tended to soften and blur fine details, which meant that the thin, precise liner line preferred by the print and film beauty establishment read as merely a shadow on the small screen. The women who appeared on early television variety programs and game shows, under the guidance of television makeup departments that were evolving rapidly in response to this new medium's specific requirements, wore a heavier liner line than their film counterparts. And because television reached into far more American living rooms than any film ever could, this television aesthetic had a democratizing influence on liner fashion that the magazines, with their sophisticated fashion readership, were slow to acknowledge. The psychological literature of the 1950s included early discussions of what we might now call the cosmetic confidence relationship, the documented effect of appearance-modifying behaviours on the self-perception and social confidence of the women who practiced them. The Society for the Study of Social Issues, whose journal published interdisciplinary research throughout the decade, included several studies examining women's cosmetic behaviour from sociological and early psychological perspectives. What these studies consistently found, in methodologically modest but suggestive ways, was that women who felt their appearance met social standards reported higher confidence in social situations, and that cosmetic preparation, including liner application, was a meaningful component of that preparation. This was not evidence of false consciousness or vanity. It was documentation of a real mechanism in a social environment where appearance carried real social consequences. The geography of liner application technique varied with eye shape, in ways that the beauty columns of the era addressed with impressive specificity. The woman with close-set eyes was instructed to begin her liner line not at the inner corner, but approximately 1/3 of the way along the lid, avoiding any darkening of the inner eye area that would emphasize the closeness. She was to extend her wing further outward to draw the visual emphasis away from the center of the face. The woman with wide-set eyes was given almost exactly opposite instructions. Begin at the inner corner, keep the wing short, concentrate the visual weight of the liner in the central portion of the lid. The woman with a heavy lid or a downturned outer corner was to direct her entire liner application upward, never allowing the line to follow the natural angle of the lid. These were not simplistic beauty tips. They were applications of genuine principles of visual perception to the specific problem of the individual face. The connection between the liner look and the social meanings of the gaze in mid-century American culture is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the entire aesthetic project. A heavily lined eye makes the gaze more visible. It darkens and defines the instrument of looking, making the act of looking more legible to the person being looked at. In a social world where women were expected to be looked at rather than to look, where the female gaze was a culturally fraught subject, where a woman who looked too directly or too long could be accused of impropriety, the defined eye was a negotiation with this tension. The liner made the gaze more powerful while the overall aesthetic of the doe-eye, wide, innocent, upswept, maintained its surface innocence. The defined eye was simultaneously more seeing and more seen, more powerful and more decorative. This ambiguity was not an accident of fashion, it was the point. The relationship between the liner look and the era's fashion for cat-eye eyeglass frames is one of the more charming convergences of mid-decade aesthetics, and it suggests that the upswept outer corner was sufficiently embedded in the visual culture of the period to manifest across multiple categories of personal adornment simultaneously. The cat-eye frame, with its upswept outer corners in plastic and sometimes rhinestone-accented acetate, was not designed to compete with liner, but to harmonize with it, and the woman who wore both was creating a layered visual statement in which the architecture of the lens frame echoed and amplified the architecture of the makeup beneath it. Fashion as a system, the 50s demonstrated, works through exactly this kind of resonance across categories. In September of 1951, the Ladies' Home Journal published a meal plan under the headline The 14-Day Slenderizing Schedule that included, among its prescribed lunches, a serving of lime gelatin mold containing precisely 3 canned pear halves, 1 tablespoon of cream cheese, and a garnish of watercress to be eaten alongside 4 saltine crackers and a cup of black coffee. The caloric calculation printed beside the menu item read 210. Beneath the meal plan ran a sidebar explaining that gelatin, being derived from protein, was inherently figure-friendly and possessed the useful property of creating a sensation of fullness while contributing almost no caloric burden. The reader was advised to eat the gelatin slowly, pausing between bites to let the satisfaction develop. This was not an aberration. It was the absolute mainstream of mid-century American dietary thinking, and understanding it requires understanding both the nutritional science, available at the time, and the social pressure that drove women toward these extraordinary inventions of table culture. The 1950s were the decade in which the American food industry, newly equipped with industrial refrigeration, improved canning technology, and the marketing infrastructure built during wartime, began producing and selling convenience foods at a scale that transformed the domestic kitchen and simultaneously produced a culture of intense, anxious attention to the body's response to this new abundance. Gelatin was the presiding icon of this culture, and its dominance in 50s diet cookbooks, magazine menus, and hostess planning guides is so total that it constitutes a kind of period-defining artifact. Knox Gelatin, which had been selling unflavoured gelatin since the 1890s, saw its sales climb dramatically throughout the post-war period. Jello, owned by General Foods, marketed both its sweet and savoury gelatin lines with advertising that appeared in every major women's magazine, and that positioned the product simultaneously as a convenience food, a festive entertaining centerpiece, and a tool for figure management. The marketing was sophisticated. Gelatin was fun, modern, scientific, and slimming. It was everything the 1950s woman was supposed to want. The diet culture of the 50s cannot be separated from the silhouette demands of 50s fashion, which were themselves extraordinary by any physiological standard. The new look introduced by Christian Dior in 1947 had established the foundational template for the decade's ideal female body: a corseted waist, a full hip, a high bosom, all presenting within an overall frame of controlled smallness. The waist measurement became the decade's primary somatic obsession, and the measurements reported for Hollywood stars, 22 inches for Ava Gardner, 18 inches for the improbably engineered figure of Scarlett O'Hara's most famous corseting scene, which had entered the cultural lexicon as an aspiration, was circulated in fan magazines and beauty columns with the status of moral exemplars. The dietary strategies pursued in service of this silhouette were bewilderingly varied, and, from the perspective of modern nutritional understanding, frequently either harmlessly pointless or actively counterproductive. The Mayo diet, which despite its name had no connection to the Mayo Clinic, circulated throughout the decade in photocopied form and prescribed a regimen heavy in grapefruit, hard-boiled eggs, and black coffee, on the theory, entirely without scientific basis, that grapefruit contained an enzyme that burned fat when consumed alongside protein. Women passed this diet to each other through social networks with the urgency of shared secret knowledge, and its very unofficial character, its lack of institutional backing, made it feel more authoritative, more like a genuine discovery that the medical establishment didn't want you to know about. The drinking man's diet, which emphasized protein and fat while restricting carbohydrates, circulated in the mid-50s as a book that sold several million copies, despite being widely criticized by established nutrition authorities. It was recognized in retrospect an early version of what would later be codified as low-carbohydrate dieting, and its underlying metabolic logic was not entirely wrong, but its promotion of alcohol as a compatible dietary component was both culturally specific to its era and medically eccentric. Women adopted it and adapted it, frequently removing the alcohol component while retaining the protein emphasis, producing a version that looked very much like the high-protein diets that would be periodically rediscovered and rebranded throughout the rest of the 20th century. Tomato juice occupied a position in 50s diet culture that it is almost impossible to overstate. The tomato juice breakfast, a 6-ounce glass of canned tomato juice, perhaps with a squeeze of lemon and a celery stick consumed in lieu of solid food, appeared in virtually every reducing regimen published in women's magazines throughout the decade. Its logic was nutritional, but also aesthetic. Tomato juice was a sophisticated, grown-up food with European associations. It contained vitamin C at a time when vitamin C had genuine cultural cachet as a healthful substance, and it was low in calories while filling enough to displace genuine hunger for a few hours. Brands like Campbell's and V8 marketed their tomato juice lines with explicit diet messaging, and the association between the slender, well-groomed American woman and her morning glass of tomato juice was firmly established as a cultural shorthand by mid-decade. Calorie counting, which had existed as a practice since the early 20th century, when the caloric value of food was first measured scientifically, achieved mass cultural penetration in the 50s through a combination of factors. The publication of pocket calorie counters, small purse-sized pamphlets listing the caloric values of common foods, became a minor publishing industry, with drugstore racks carrying multiple competing editions. Women's magazines ran calorie counts alongside their recipes with the same matter-of-fact authority they brought to cook times and cup measurements. The calorie was presented as a rational, democratic unit of control. Unlike social status or genetic inheritance, calories could be counted and managed by anyone with the discipline to keep track. What the science of the era did not yet understand well, and what modern nutritional research has substantially clarified, is the complex interplay between caloric restriction, hormonal response, and long-term metabolic function. The women following their 14-day slenderizing schedules with their lime gelatin molds and tomato juice breakfasts were operating in good faith within the best available knowledge of their era. They were not, as later cultural criticism sometimes implies, passive victims of corporate manipulation. They were active agents making choices based on real information, even if that information was incomplete. The tragedy of 50s diet culture, if it is a tragedy, is not that women were deceived, but that the tools available to them were genuinely inadequate to the biological complexity of the problem they were trying to solve, while the social pressure to solve it was immense, constant, and entirely non-negotiable. The Gaylord Hauser phenomenon of the early 1950s represents one of the more intellectually colourful episodes in mid-century diet culture, and deserves more attention than it typically receives in histories of the period. Hauser, a German-born nutritionist with genuine charisma and highly debatable scientific credentials, had published his best-selling book Look Younger, Live Longer in 1950, and its emphasis on what he called wonder foods. Brewer's yeast, wheat germ, powdered skim milk, blackstrap molasses and yogurt, consumed in quantities that most of his readers found challenging, created a minor health food movement years before the mainstream American public was ready to embrace it. Hauser's celebrity clientele, which included Greta Garbo and the Duchess of Windsor, gave his recommendations a social luster that overcame the inherent improbability of his prescriptions, and the woman who carefully measured her tablespoon of blackstrap molasses into her morning yogurt was not merely following nutritional advice, she was participating in an aspirational lifestyle shared, she believed, with some of the most glamorous women in the world. The corporate food industry's participation in diet culture was not passive or merely responsive to consumer demand. It was active, creative, and often determinative. General Foods, which owned the Jell-O brand, employed a marketing team that worked closely with the women's magazine editorial departments throughout the decade, supplying recipe ideas, promotional tie-ins, and advertising copy that positioned Jell-O simultaneously as a convenience food, an entertaining centerpiece, and a figure management tool. The Jell-O gelatin mold as centerpiece, the aspic ring with its suspended vegetables, the lime gelatin with its canned fruit artfully distributed, the elegant presentation on a plate of iceberg lettuce, was as much a product of corporate food marketing as it was of domestic creativity. The women who made these molds were executing a script that had been written for them with considerable commercial intention, and they did so willingly because the script aligned with real, social pressures and genuine desires. The diet pill culture of the 1950s is a chapter that present-day histories sometimes pass over quickly, perhaps because its pharmacology looks so alarming in retrospect. Amphetamine-based appetite suppressants, which had been used in clinical settings since the late 1930s, had by the early 50s entered the consumer market in the form of diet pills that doctors prescribed with considerable casualness. The combination of genuine appetite suppression with the stimulant side effects of the amphetamine class, increased energy, elevated mood, a sense of focused competence, made these pills enormously attractive to women who were simultaneously managing the demands of domestic life and attempting to conform to the body standards of their era. The prescribing culture of the period was not ignorant of the drug's addictive potential, but the medical profession's risk-benefit calculus on the subject was heavily weighted toward the perceived benefits. A thinner, more energetic patient was visible evidence of treatment success, and the dependency risk was a future concern that the social pressures of the present made easy to defer. The Weight Watchers organization, which would not be founded until 1963 by Jean Nedetsch in Queens, New York, was not yet a presence in the 1950s landscape, but the social structures it would eventually institutionalize, the group weigh-in, the peer support and accountability, the semi-ritualized public commitment, existed informally throughout the decade in the charity league meetings, church social circles, and neighborhood women's groups where diet culture was a constant subject of discussion. Women shared recipes, compared progress, and held each other to standards through the normal mechanisms of social life. The formalization that Weight Watchers would later provide simply put an institutional structure around something that was already happening organically, driven by the same social pressures and the same desire for community around a shared project that the decade's diet culture had always contained. The recipe infrastructure that supported 50s diet culture, The reducing cookbooks, the calorie-counted recipe cards, the diet menus printed on tear-out pages in women's magazines, constitutes a fascinating archive of the era's nutritional assumptions and domestic priorities. Books like Adele Davis's Let's Eat Right to Keep Fit, published in 1954, challenged the gelatin and tomato juice orthodoxy with a more genuinely nutritional approach that emphasized whole foods and adequate protein, and while Davis's science was not uniformly sound by modern standards, her insistence that real food adequately prepared was both more nourishing and more satisfying than the reducing diet culture's assembled compromises represented a genuine intellectual alternative to the mainstream, that she was largely ignored by the women's magazines, whose advertising relationship with the processed food industry made her message commercially inconvenient, tells its own story. The specific cultural function of the reducing salon in mid-50s America represents a parallel track to the diet food culture that deserves acknowledgement. The reducing salon, a specialized beauty establishment offering treatments including steam cabinets, vibrating belts, wax wraps, and manual massage, proliferated throughout American cities and suburbs during the decade, offering women a passive route to the slenderized figure that the diet columns promised through active self-denial. The scientific basis for most of these treatments was entirely absent, and the results they produced were primarily temporary water loss rather than any structural change in body composition. But the reducing salon served a genuine social function beyond the physical. It was a dedicated space where women could attend to their bodies in an environment that normalized the project of body management and provided social support for it. The steam cabinet was no more effective than the gelatin mold diet, but both represented the same cultural investment in the female body as a project whose completion was both possible and obligatory. At approximately 9:30 on a Tuesday evening in October of 1955, in a bungalow on a tree-lined street in suburban Cincinnati, a woman named Patricia sat at her vanity mirror and began the 45-minute process of converting her damp, freshly washed hair into 47 separate pin curls, each one wound with a precision that would have satisfied an engineer and secured with a single flat metal clip that she positioned at the base of the curl, with the practiced confidence of someone who had performed this operation several hundred times before. She was preparing for a Wednesday morning at the office where she worked as an executive secretary. She was preparing, in every functional sense, for public life. The pin curl was the dominant hair-setting technology of the American 1950s, and understanding it requires understanding both its mechanical logic and the extraordinary amount of daily labour it represented. Unlike the roller set, which would begin displacing the pin curl in popularity by the early 60s, the pin curl required no specialised equipment beyond a comb, setting lotion, and flat metal clips. It was adaptable to any hair length above chin level, customisable in curl size and direction, and technically capable of producing a range of finished results from loose, romantic waves to tight, structured ringlets to the softly lifted rolls and bumps that characterised the most elegant 50s hairstyles. A woman who had mastered the pin curl was not dependent on any technology she could not pack in a handbag. The process began, always, with either freshly washed hair or hair that had been spritzed with water until uniformly damp, not wet, which would take too long to dry and might mildew under the setting net, not dry, which would not hold the set. The dampness was the medium through which the curl memory was established. Hair in its wet state is physically malleable in a way that dry hair is not. The hydrogen bonds within the keratin structure are temporarily disrupted by water, allowing the hair strand to be bent, wrapped, or shaped, and then, as the hair dries, those hydrogen bonds reform in the new configuration. The curl set by a pin curl was, in the most literal sense, a restructuring of the hair's molecular architecture. Setting lotion, sold under brands including Helen Curtis spray net precursors, Lilt, and various drugstore house brands, was applied before the winding process began. The setting lotions of the early 50s were typically shellac-based, providing hold through a thin, stiff resin film deposited on each hair strand, or they were sugar-based, using a solution of sugar or gum arabic in water to provide a lightweight tackiness that helped the curl stay wound during drying without the stiffness of shellac. Both had their devotees and their detractors. The shellac formulations provided stronger hold but were sensitive to humidity and could become sticky in warm weather, while the sugar formulations were gentler on the hair but required more careful application to avoid uneven distribution. The actual winding technique was highly specific and widely taught. The standard pin curl was made by taking a section of hair, no wider than 1 inch, no thicker than 1/4 inch, holding it taut and extended at 90 degrees from the scalp, then winding it smoothly around the index finger in the direction of the desired wave, and finally sliding the wound curl off the finger while maintaining its shape and pinning it flat against the scalp with the metal clip. The direction of each curl was determined by the overall style plan. A woman setting for a soft page boy would wind all her curls toward the face in the lower sections and away from the face at the temples. A woman setting for a specific wave pattern would alternate clockwise and counterclockwise curls in a systematic alternating arrangement that would produce, when brushed out, a smooth, undulating wave rather than a frizzed mass of individual spirals. The number of pin curls required for a complete set varied by hairstyle and hair length, but for the average woman with shoulder-length hair setting a medium wave style, the count ran between 40 and 60 individual curls. This was not a casual undertaking. It was a sustained, skilled procedure requiring good light, a fine-tooth comb or rat-tail comb for sectioning patients, and sufficient manual dexterity to maintain the wound curl on the scalp while reaching for the clip with the same hand. Women learned this technique from their mothers, from beauty school graduates among their social circle, from the tutorials printed in monthly beauty magazines, and, for the most ambitious homesetters, from the brief instructional booklets sold by setting lotion manufacturers as promotional inserts. Once the full set was wound and pinned, the hair was covered with a hairnet. Not the hairnet of institutional kitchen workers, but the delicate mesh net sold in beauty supply sections, made from fine nylon or silk thread in shades designed to be invisible against common hair colours. The net held the pin curls in position while the woman slept, preventing the inevitable disturbance of pillow contact from disrupting the set. Over the net went for the dedicated setter a sleep cap, a gathered or elasticized cap in satin or nylon, designed to protect the set from both displacement and absorption of natural skin oils from the pillow surface. Drying occurred either naturally through the night, the standard process, or, for women setting in the morning for an evening appointment, under a hooded salon-style dryer. The home-hooded dryer was a significant consumer product introduction of the late 1940s and early 50s, and its adoption was rapid among women who had previously made salon visits for their sets. The Conair Corporation and other appliance manufacturers brought the price of home hood dryers within reach of the middle-class market by mid-decade, and the sight of a woman reading a magazine or mending under a softly humming dome of warm air became a recognizable domestic tableau of the era. The morning brushing out was its own ceremony, distinct from the winding process but equal to it in technical sophistication. The pins were removed, the net lifted, and then the curls were not combed out, combing produced frizz, but brushed out with a natural bristle brush in long, sweeping strokes that blended the individual curls into the smooth, unified wave structure the set had created. The direction of each brush stroke, the angle of the brush to the scalp, the amount of tension applied, all of these variables affected the final result. Some women backcombed the root area lightly for lift before the final smoothing, a technique known as teasing or ratting that created volume without visible texture at the surface. The finishing touch was a light spray of lacquer, which would, by the early 1960s, evolve into the industrial-strength hairsprays that defined the Buffon era, but in the mid-50s was still a relatively light, flexible hold product. The perfection of the 50s set, the smooth, bouncy, apparently effortless wave that characterized the decade's ideal hair, was the product of this entire labour-intensive process. The dampening, the lotioning, the 47 carefully wound curls, the night under the net, the ceremonial morning brushing. The effortlessness was the point and also the fiction. No part of the process was effortless. Every wave was earned. The social class dimensions of the pin curl culture are worth examining carefully, because they complicate the simple narrative of universal feminine beauty labour. The pin curl was, in a sense, a democratic technology. It required nothing beyond skill and time, both of which were available to women across the socio-economic spectrum, but the meaning of performing it varied significantly by class position. For the working-class woman who did her own hair because she could not afford regular salon visits, the pin curl was a survival skill, a way of maintaining a presentable appearance within constrained economic means. For the professional class woman who could have afforded a weekly salon set but chose to maintain her own hair between appointments, The pin curl was a demonstration of competence and self-sufficiency. For the upper-middle-class woman who set her hair at home entirely from preference, it was a kind of domestic craft, satisfying in the same way as any well-executed handwork. The beauty salon as a social institution in the 1950s occupied a position in the women's social life that has no precise modern equivalent. The weekly or bi-weekly salon visit, which was the standard for American women above the working class throughout the decade, was not merely a maintenance appointment, but a social event, a space of female community distinct from the domestic sphere, where conversation flowed freely and was not subject to the social constraints of mixed company. The hair salon was one of the few spaces in mid-century American women's social geography that was entirely female and entirely freed from the performance of domestic femininity that governed most of the rest of their social life. The relationships between regular customers and their hairdressers were often long-term, emotionally significant, and genuinely intimate in the specific way that the service relationship creates intimacy. The hairdresser knew things about her client's life because the client talked while sitting captive in the chair that the client might not share in other contexts. The chemistry of setting lotions evolved significantly across the decade in ways that both reflected and enabled changing fashion. The early shellac-based lotions, while effective, had limitations that became more apparent as hair fashion began to emphasize flexibility and movement alongside hold. The stiff, immovable wave that shellac produced was appropriate for the sculpted, controlled coiffures of the early 50s, but became less suitable as the decade's end approached and fashion began to favor slightly softer, more mobile effects. The development of synthetic polymer-based setting agents, early versions of what would eventually become polyvinyl pyrrolidone, the primary hold agent in most modern styling products, began in the mid-50s and produced lotions that offered improved flexibility without sacrificing hold. The transition from shellac to synthetic polymer in setting lotion formulation was one of the significant technical developments of the decade's beauty product industry, though it was invisible to the consumers who experienced it only as an improvement in their finished results. The competitive dimension of the mid-century beauty set deserves acknowledgement. Women in the 1950s did evaluate each other's hair, and the quality of a woman's set was a visible signal of the time and skill she was willing to invest in her appearance, which was itself a signal of her social seriousness. A poorly executed wave, uneven, frizzy at the ends, flat at the crown, communicated something unfavourable in a social world that treated female appearance as evidence of character. The woman whose set was consistently excellent, whose wave was smooth and her volume precisely controlled, was demonstrating on a weekly basis a form of ongoing competence that was socially legible and socially rewarded. The beauty contest dynamic that governed so much of mid-century feminine social life was not confined to formal events. It played out across every church supper, every coffee morning, every PTA meeting where women gathered to be seen. The intersection of pin curl practice with wartime memory deserves brief acknowledgement, because many of the women setting their hair with such dedication in the early 1950s had learned the technique during the war years, when salon visits were expensive and public appearance standards remained high despite the general austerity. The pin curl had been a wartime skill, learned from mothers and sisters and passed along dormitory halls and factory locker rooms, and its peacetime continuation carried some of that wartime associations of female solidarity and practical self-sufficiency. The woman who could set her own hair properly was a woman who could take care of herself, and in the specific emotional vocabulary of the post-war moment, that self-sufficiency carried weight. In 1950, the Patricia Stevens Career College in Chicago enrolled its largest class in its history. Over 400 young women who had come to study what the school's catalogue described as the complete program in poise, personality, and professional presentation. The course of study ran 12 weeks for the intensive certificate program and 18 months for the full diploma, and its curriculum covered, in documented detail, the correct method for entering and exiting an automobile while wearing a full-length skirt without displacing the hem, the precise angle at which the chin should be held during a formal introduction, the proper management of a handbag and gloves during a stand-up social reception, and the technique of descending a staircase while maintaining an absolutely erect spine and speaking without interruption. The book on the head exercise, which had become the international symbol of finishing school culture, was used at Patricia Stevens not as a party trick but as a diagnostic and corrective tool. It was the physical examination that revealed exactly which muscles were failing to do their postural work, and the correction of those failures was the beginning of the transformation the school promised. The charm school and finishing house tradition in 1950s, America was an industry of considerable scale and social legitimacy, and it served a clientele that ranged far beyond the wealthy young women who had historically constituted the market for European finishing education. The post-war democratization of the middle class, produced by the G1 Bill, suburban home ownership, rising wages, and expanding white-collar employment, had created millions of families whose daughters were ascending to social situations for which nothing in their background had prepared them. A girl whose mother had worked in a factory and whose grandmother had been an immigrant was now expected to conduct herself at a corporate dinner, navigate a country club social, represent her husband's professional ambitions at his firm's Christmas party, and do all of this with the confident ease of someone who had been born knowing the rules. The charm school sold that ease, or sold the appearance of it, which in social terms amounted to the same thing. The curriculum of the typical charm school of the period addressed itself to three distinct domains: the physical, the social, and the verbal. The physical domain included posture and carriage, the book on the head exercise being the most famous component, but a much larger curriculum underlying it, as well as the management of gesture, which was given considerable systematic attention. Hand gestures in the 50s, ideal were contained and purposeful. The habit of speaking with large, expansive hand movements was associated with lower class or ethnic expressiveness and was to be controlled. The correct position of the hands when standing was either clasped lightly at the front, held at the sides, or managing a prop such as a handbag or gloves. Hands in pockets were absolutely forbidden in any formal social context. Walking received its own extensive treatment. The standard instruction, which appeared in virtually identical form in the written materials of dozens of charm schools from New York to Los Angeles, prescribed a gait in which the feet were placed along a single imaginary line, with each step's heel touching that line exactly, producing the slight hip swing that characterized the model's runway walk and that was understood as simultaneously elegant and feminine. The stride length was to be moderate, never striding, never shuffling. The shoulders were to be held back and down, the sternum lifted, the chin parallel to the floor. This configuration, maintained through a full social evening, was genuinely physically demanding. It required the constant engagement of postural muscles that most sedentary women had not systematically developed, and the physical training component of the charm school curriculum was real exercise, though it would not have been described in those terms. The social curriculum addressed the grammar of American upper-middle-class social interaction with considerable specificity. The formal introduction protocol, who was introduced to whom, in which order, with what precise verbal formula, was still a live social concern in the 1950s, in a way that it would not be by the 1970s, and getting it wrong in certain company carried genuine social cost. The correct formula for introducing a man to a woman was to speak to the woman first, naming the man, "Mrs. Whitfield, may I present Mr. Henderson?" Never the reverse, which implied precedence of the male. The correct formula for introducing an older person to a younger was to speak to the older person first. The correct formula for introducing a guest to a host was to speak to the guest first. These rules had internal logic, and that logic was teachable, but the rules themselves were detailed enough that someone who had not been systematically taught them would make errors regularly. The table etiquette curriculum was extensive and technically precise. The placement of silverware at each course, the progression from outside to inside across each cover as courses arrived, the management of the finger bowl, the correct way to eat soup without producing sound, or leaving the soup spoon in the bowl between sips, the proper approach to foods that presented handling difficulties, artichoke hearts, lobster, soft-shelled crab, all of these were addressed systematically, practiced at table mock-ups, and assessed by instructors with the rigour of an examination. The underlying principle was always the same. Perfect manners were invisible manners, and invisibility came only from such thorough internalization that the rules became automatic, never requiring conscious retrieval during a social occasion when attention was needed elsewhere. The verbal curriculum addressed not only what was said, but how it was said. Elocution, the systematic improvement of speech clarity, pronunciation, and vocal tone, was a component of virtually every charm school program, and this was not merely about accent correction, though regional accent remediation was certainly offered and sought. It was about the quality of the speaking voice as a social instrument, its warmth, its control, its carrying power without straining, its flexibility across registers from intimate conversation to addressing a room. Women were taught to modulate volume, to avoid the rising terminal inflection that communicated uncertainty, to hold eye contact during conversation in a way that conveyed engagement without challenging the social hierarchy. Conversational boundaries were taught with particular care because the social world of the 50s had clear and enforced rules about what a woman might introduce into conversation in various contexts. In mixed company at a formal dinner, a woman was expected to be able to sustain conversation on a range of neutral, pleasant subjects, current events as they appeared in the mainstream press, arts and cultural events, family and domestic matters, travel and social news. She was expected not to introduce politics in a partisan way, not to discuss money directly, not to speak negatively of mutual acquaintances, and absolutely not to speak of personal grievances or emotional difficulties. The charm school curriculum taught both the positive list, subjects that were always safe and sociable, and the management of attempts to draw one into the prohibited zones. Looking back at this curriculum now, it is difficult not to see in its elaborate prescriptions a very efficient system for producing women who were socially invisible in precisely the ways that the surrounding social structure found most convenient. The perfect charm school graduate was adept at facilitating other people's social comfort, skilled at suppressing her own authentic expression in favour of harmonious performance, and trained to interpret the performance of these skills as a form of personal excellence rather than a form of social control. That these skills also had genuine practical value in navigating a world she had not made, and that many of the women who acquired them found genuine satisfaction in their mastery, does not simplify the picture. The charm school sold a product that its era believed in completely, and its era was not wrong that the product worked, only perhaps about whose interests that work primarily served. The economics of the charm school industry in the 1950s was significant and reflected both the genuine demand for the services offered and the commercial opportunity that social anxiety reliably creates. The tuition charged by major urban charm schools, Patricia Stevens, Barbizon, the John Robert Powers School, was substantial relative to average family incomes of the period, and the marketing that attracted students was sophisticated in its identification and exploitation of the specific anxieties it was designed to address. A young woman entering the white-collar workforce, the wife of a newly promoted executive, the daughter of an immigrant family making her debut in middle-class social life, each of these had specific vulnerabilities that the charm school advertising addressed with surgical precision, promising not merely grooming tips, but the fundamental transformation of social identity. The Barbizon School, which operated through a franchise model across dozens of American cities, was perhaps the most successful charm school enterprise of the decade, and its history illuminates both the genuine service and the considerable commercial machinery underlying the industry. Barbizon positioned itself not merely as a finishing school but as a modelling and career school, the implication being that a Barbizon graduate might not only become more socially polished, but might actually pursue a modelling career. The reality was that very few Barbizon graduates became working models, and the school's business model depended primarily on the tuition of the vast majority who did not, but the aspiration functioned as an effective marketing tool and the retail component of the Barbizon business, which involved selling the students on the appropriate wardrobe and cosmetics they would need for the course, generated additional revenue that subsidized the educational operation. The posture instruction that was central to charm school curricula reflected a genuine mid-century preoccupation with the body as a social text. The 1950s were deeply invested in the idea that the body's carriage communicated character, that a woman who held herself well was demonstrating through her spine and her shoulders the internal organization that the era demanded. This was not a merely aesthetic preference. It was connected to the physiological understanding of the time, which held that proper posture was healthful in addition to being beautiful, and to the social understanding, which held that a woman who could not be bothered to stand straight was demonstrating a kind of self-neglect that extended beyond the physical. The charm school's insistence on posture was, in this context, entirely consistent with its broader mission of producing women who showed up for their social responsibilities with full commitment. The finishing house tradition, which in its European form had served the daughters of aristocratic and upper bourgeois families since the 19th century, was adapted in its American mid-century incarnation to serve a substantially more democratic market, and this adaptation required significant curriculum revision. The European finishing school assumed students who already spoke French, who had travelled, who had been educated in the cultural references that constituted social literacy for the European elite. The American charm school could assume none of this, and had to provide a more basic foundation: the rules of precedence at a formal dinner table, the management of a receiving line, the protocol for a debutante ball, that the European school could take for granted. The American version was, in a sense, a more honest institution precisely because its artifice was more visible. It was explicitly in the business of manufacturing social polish in women who had not been born to it, rather than refining and confirming polish that was assumed to be already present. The specific social grammar taught at charm schools for the management of uncomfortable conversational situations reveals how precisely codified the era's social expectations had become. The technique for deflecting a question one did not wish to answer was taught under the rubric of graceful redirection, a practiced set of verbal moves that acknowledged the question, expressed warm interest in the questioner, and pivoted smoothly to a related topic that permitted the conversation to continue without the disclosure the question had sought. This was not deception in the era's formulation, it was tact, the lubricant of social life, and its mastery was a mark of social intelligence. The woman who could perform this redirection without visible effort had internalized a set of social navigation skills that would serve her reliably across the varied demands of her social life. There is an object, measuring approximately 3 inches in diameter and weighing no more than 2 ounces, that tells you almost everything you need to know about mid-century American femininity if you know how to read it. It is a powder compact made by Stratton of Birmingham, England, circa 1954, its outer case cast in gilded brass with a repeating floral motif rendered in champagne and ivory enamel, its inner surfaces lined with a beveled mirror on one side and a flat circular pad of chamois leather on the other, behind which a shallow well holds a pressed powder cake in a shade described in the original catalogue as ivory bisque. The clasp is a simple spring mechanism that opens with a satisfying click, a click engineered with specific attention to both the auditory and tactile satisfaction it produces. The entire object is exquisitely made, expensive for its era, and designed to be used in public. That last element, designed to be used in public, is where the compact's cultural meaning resides. The powder compact of the 1950s was not merely a container for cosmetics. It was an instrument of social performance, a prop in a theatre of femininity that played out in department store lounges, at bridge club tables, in theatre intermission lobbies, and at the cocktail parties that punctuated the social calendar of the upwardly mobile post-war American woman. To open a compact and powder one's nose was to perform, in the most public possible way, one's membership in a particular category of well-maintained, self-aware womanhood. The gesture was ritualistic and deliberate, and it communicated a great deal. The compact had been a fashionable accessory since at least the 1920s, when the loosening of prohibitions against women applying cosmetics in public had transformed what had been a furtive private act into something socially permitted, even expected. By the 50s, the compact was a thoroughly normalized feature of female social life, and the variety of objects produced to serve this market was staggering. The low end of the market was served by domestic American manufacturers like Elgin American, whose pressed metal compacts in silver tone and gold tone finishes were sold at department store counters and drug stores, and were entirely serviceable, affordable objects designed to do the utilitarian job of carrying powder. The high end was dominated by European makers, Stratton and Kigu from England, Volupte from the United States but with European design sensibilities, and the Swiss makers whose enamel work on precious metal compacts sold through jewellers and luxury goods boutiques at prices that placed them firmly in the category of personal jewellery. Stratton's commercial success in the American market throughout the 1950s was built on a specific innovation, the self-opening mechanism, patented in 1948, which allowed the compact to be opened with a single finger pressed to a central button, rather than requiring the two-handed manipulation of most spring clasps. This was a seemingly minor functional improvement, but its social significance was considerable. A woman could open her compact with one hand while holding a cocktail glass in the other, or while managing a handbag and gloves, and the one-handed gesture was both more elegant and more practical than the two-handed alternative. Stratton marketed this feature with intelligence, and the self-opening compact became strongly associated with their brand to the point where Stratton Compact and good compact became near synonymous in the lexicon of mid-50s beauty accessories. The cultural norms surrounding public compact use were specific enough to constitute a minor etiquette domain of their own. Powdering the nose, the phrase itself with its coy euphemism for visiting the bathroom, tells you something about the social coding involved, was performed at the table in informal social settings and in the powder room in formal ones. The powder room, a dedicated space in well-appointed homes and restaurants specifically for this purpose, represented a significant architectural and social institution. It was the one space where women could attend to their appearance without the implication that they were primping, because the space itself was designated for exactly this activity. But the compact use at the table, in the restaurant, at the theatre, this was a social act, and it was governed by clear rules about when it was and was not acceptable. The application itself was a display performance with its own choreography. The compact was removed from the handbag, itself an art, since a woman who had to root around in her bag for the compact lost the moment's elegance, and opened with the prescribed one-handed or two-handed gesture depending on the mechanism. The puff was pressed to the powder cake and then to the face in specific areas: the forehead, the nose, the chin, the T-zone that most reliably showed shine through the day's foundation. The mirror was used not for extended examination but for a quick, efficient check. The compact was then closed, again with the single practiced movement, and returned to the bag. The entire operation, done correctly, occupied approximately 30 seconds, and was meant to appear even briefer. The collecting culture around vintage compacts, which would develop dramatically in the decades following the 50s as the objects became antiques, was already nascent within the decade itself. Women who had been building their compact collections throughout the 30s and 40s continued to do so in the 50s, and the gift of a fine compact was understood as a suitable and elegant present for a woman on any significant occasion, from birthday to wedding anniversary to the kind of thank you gift exchanged among friends of a certain social standing. Volupté produced compact lines in novelty shapes: handbag-shaped compacts, book-shaped compacts, compacts disguised as playing cards, that were intended as much as collectible objects as functional accessories, and their sale through gift departments rather than cosmetics counters reflects this dual nature. The psychology of the compact as possession, as a beautiful, portable object that belonged entirely to the woman who carried it, in a domestic world where most possessions were shared family property, was not lost on the women who chose and used these objects. A fine compact was hers. It was beautiful because she had chosen it to be beautiful. It sat in her handbag like a small, complete world of feminine self-regard, and when she opened it in public, she was performing not merely the act of powdering her nose, but the act of declaring, to anyone who could read the object's quality and the confidence with which it was produced, that she was a woman who maintained standards. The compact was a claim about who she was. The care she brought to choosing and using it was, in the most literal sense, self-expression. The Elgin American Company, which was the dominant producer of mid-market compacts throughout the 1950s, operated from a manufacturing facility in Elgin, Illinois, that had originally produced pocket watch cases, which explained both the company's name and its expertise in precision metalwork at small scale. The transition from watch case manufacturing to compact production was technically natural. Both required the same combination of thin metal stamping, precision hinge and clasp engineering, and decorative surface work in enamel, gold plate and engraving. Elgin American compacts were not luxury objects in the Stratton or Volupté sense, but they were extremely well-made items at their price point, and their production quality, the solid heft, the snug closure, the clean interior finish, was sufficient to give their owners real satisfaction without the premium cost of the European luxury makers. The department store compact counter was one of the more sensuously intense retail environments of the mid-century shopping experience. The glass cases containing compacts in their multiple varieties, gilded, enamelled, novelty-shaped, initialed, floral-patterned, geometric, were lit from below to produce the maximum sparkle from metallic surfaces, and the counters were positioned near the main cosmetics area, where the ambient scent of powder and perfume created an olfactory context perfectly calibrated to the purchasing impulse. The sales assistant behind the compact counter was a specific professional type, knowledgeable about the technical differences between products, skilled at reading which style would appeal to which customer, and practiced in the social theatre of the gift-buying transaction, which was often as much about the experience of selecting the gift as about the gift itself. The custom compact market, which operated at the upper end of the industry and which connected to the world of precious jewellery, produced objects of considerable artistic quality throughout the 1950s. Houses like Cartier, Van Cleef and Arpels, and the major Swiss enamel workshops produced compacts in gold and silver with enamel work of extraordinary delicacy, set with gemstones, personalised with engraved monograms, and presented in velvet-lined cases that made the opening of the gift box a complete experience. These objects circulated primarily as significant gifts, from husbands to wives on anniversaries, from families to daughters on landmark occasions, and they were understood as the kind of personal object that might properly be kept for a lifetime and eventually passed on. The compact at this level of the market was genuinely jewellery that happened to serve a cosmetic function. The psychology of the public compact ritual has one additional dimension worth examining: the compact mirror's specific size and framing. Unlike a full mirror, which shows the entire face and invites comprehensive self-examination, the compact mirror shows only a portion, typically enough for the nose and cheeks, and the limited frame enforces a kind of selective attention. You use the compact mirror to check specific defined areas: the powder distribution on the nose, the lipstick on the centre of the upper lip. You do not use it for extended contemplation of your appearance as a whole. This constraint was not a design failure, it was a feature. The public display of concern for one's appearance was acceptable within the specific, time-limited, purposive frame that the compact ritual defined. Extended self-regard was something else, and something less approved. The compact's small mirror enforced the social contract that allowed the ritual at all. The compact's role in the broader accessory culture of the 1950s extended to its relationship with the matching set. The coordinated collection of compact lipstick case, cigarette case, and sometimes card case that a well-appointed woman might carry in a complementary colour scheme to her outfit. These matching sets were sold as ensembles by department stores and gift shops, and they represented the era's characteristic investment in the total look, the unified aesthetic presentation that extended from clothing to shoes to bag to cosmetic accessories. A woman who produced a compact that precisely matched her bag's hardware when she opened her handbag was performing a level of coordination that spoke to the care and thought she had brought to her presentation, and it was noticed by other women who understood the effort it represented. The compact's intersection with the wider culture of personal monogramming that characterized mid-century American luxury consumption is worth noting as a final observation on the object's cultural weight. The practice of having one's initials or full name engraved on a compact was widespread across the quality spectrum, from the simple block letter engraving available at any jewellery counter, for a modest fee, to the elaborate script monograms that a prestige engraver might spend hours executing on a gold case Cartier compact. The monogrammed compact was personalised in the most literal sense. It bore the owner's name, was exclusively hers, and could not be passed off as belonging to anyone else. In a domestic world where most objects were anonymous or generically household, the named compact was a small but genuine assertion of individual identity. It said, "This belongs to me, and I have declared that ownership publicly in permanent mark." On a Saturday evening in March of 1956, in a house in the Shaker Heights neighbourhood of Cleveland, a woman known to her social circle as Bet had been preparing since 2 in the afternoon for a gathering that would not begin until 7. The devilled eggs had been piped at 4, the yolk mixture forced through a fluted pastry tip into the whites, each one with a precise dusting of sweet paprika applied via a small sieve to ensure uniform distribution. The bar cart had been arranged at 5, bourbon and Scotch whisky on the upper tier alongside a small silver ice bucket, and a pair of crystal highball glasses, the gin and dry vermouth in the front section of the lower tier for the martini drinkers, the sherry decanted into the proper sherry decanter, and positioned to the right, away from the spirits. The cigarette boxes on the coffee table had been filled with fresh cigarettes, her husband's preferred brand for him, a milder blend for the ladies' side of the table. The ashtrays had been counted, one for each seating position in the living room, each one set exactly in the centre of its adjacent surface. At 6 o'clock, Bet had gone upstairs to dress. This level of preparation was not extraordinary. It was the documented, discussed and actively taught standard for the 1950s suburban hostess, and the guidance literature produced to support it, the entertaining columns in Good Housekeeping, the cocktail party chapters in Amy Vanderbilt's Complete Book of Etiquette, The specialized hostess guides published by brands like Kraft and General Foods as promotional material constitutes one of the most detailed records of domestic social performance available from any era in American history. The cocktail hour, in its mid-century American form, was a highly engineered social event with specific physical requirements, temporal structures, and social choreography, and the woman who hosted it was responsible for engineering all of these elements simultaneously while presenting herself as having done none of the work at all. The bar cart was the physical and social centre of the cocktail hour, and its arrangement was taken with considerable seriousness. The ideal position in the room was away from the main seating area. The host or husband would stand at the bar cart, receiving guests who moved toward it, rather than the bar cart being positioned in the social centre where it would compete with conversation. This separation also allowed the host to use the bar cart as a social management tool. A guest who was becoming too comfortable in a corner could be drawn into movement by an invitation to come say hello while I freshen your drink. The physical choreography of the gathering was the hostess's responsibility, and she managed it through a combination of architectural arrangement and social initiative. The mechanics of cocktail mixing had been absorbed by the mid-50s into a sophisticated consumer culture with its own vocabulary, equipment standards, and informal competency expectations. The martini, which had undergone considerable evolution in the immediate post-war years, trending progressively drier as the decade advanced, with the vermouth ratio shrinking from the pre-war 2-to-1 gin to vermouth to the post-war 4-to-1, and in some stylish circles higher, was the prestige drink of the suburban professional class, and the ability to make a proper one was a genuine social skill for men and a matter of procurement expertise for their wives. Crystal martini pitchers and long-handled stirring spoons were standard bar cart equipment. The shaker, considered by martini purists to bruise the gin, occupied a slightly lower status, but was appropriate for the daub and shake method preferred by many guests. The food dimension of the cocktail hour followed its own specific logic, which was entirely distinct from dinner party entertaining and required a different set of skills and preparations. The cocktail party food canon of the mid-50s was extensive and remarkably specific. Deviled eggs, of course, and their variations. Cheese straws, which required a recipe and some baking skill. Stuffed celery sticks filled with cream cheese mixtures seasoned with Worcestershire or paprika. Small open-faced sandwiches on rounds of white bread, trimmed of crusts, with combinations such as cucumber and cream cheese, smoked salmon with dill, or egg salad with watercress, toasted walnuts and almonds, and, almost universally, a bowl of mixed salted cocktail nuts positioned at each conversational cluster in the room. The spatial planning of a cocktail party was taught in entertaining guides, with the methodical attention of an architectural brief. The standard advice prescribed clearing the furniture to create enough circulation space that guests could move freely between conversation clusters without being required to squeeze past seated parties, or to raise their voices across distances that would fragment the room into competing acoustic zones. The seating that remained was arranged in clusters of 3 or 4 positions, enough to sustain a conversation, not so much as to create a fixed group that would resist the social mixing the hostess was supposed to facilitate. Conversation flow, the deliberate seeding of introductions and topic launches to keep the social energy moving, was understood as a hostessing skill as real as any culinary one. The timing of the cocktail hour was carefully managed. An invitation specifying 7 o'clock was understood to actually begin at 7:15, when the first guests would arrive. The gathering was expected to reach its social peak, the largest number of guests present simultaneously, the highest conversational energy, at approximately 8 to 8:30, and would wind down naturally for dinner or departure by 9 or 9:30. A skilled hostess managed this temporal arc with attention. She watched for the moment when the energy in the room began to fragment into restless small conversations, which indicated the group was ready for transition, and she moved decisively to provide it, announcing dinner if that was the plan, or making a warm but signal farewell to the first group of departures to give permission to those who were ready to go. The social labour involved in all of this was immense, and it was almost entirely invisible in the ideology of the era, which presented the perfect cocktail party as a natural emanation of the naturally gracious hostess, rather than as the product of hours of preparation and constant attentive management. The hostess who revealed the labour, who mentioned the preparation time, who looked tired, who allowed any logistical concern to surface into the social foreground, had failed in the terms of the era's standard, regardless of how beautiful her deviled eggs were. The performance demanded seamlessness, and seamlessness demanded invisible work. That this work was entirely gendered. The bar cart arrangement was considered the husband's domain. The food and conversation management was entirely hers, was simply the way things were organised, and its inequity was not a discussable subject at the cocktail parties, where it was most fully embodied. The relationship between the cocktail hour and the domestic architecture of the post-war American suburb was not coincidental. The ranch house and the split level, which were the dominant residential forms of the suburban building boom throughout the decade, typically included a living room of specific proportions, large enough for a social gathering of 8 to 12 persons, open to the adjacent dining room or kitchen to a degree that earlier domestic architecture had not permitted, designed to flow rather than compartmentalize. This floor plan was not merely an architectural preference, it was a social prescription. The open plan enabled a specific kind of entertaining that required the hostess to manage both spaces simultaneously, and the design of the house reflected and reinforced the expectation that she would do so regularly. The bar cart's evolution as a domestic object across the decade reflects both the normalization of at-home cocktail culture and the period's investment in the presentation of that culture as a form of sophisticated self-expression. The early post-war bar cart was a relatively utilitarian object, a wheeled trolley with a lower shelf for bottles and an upper surface for preparation. By the mid-decade, however, the bar cart had become a prestige object in its own right, available in chrome and brass finishes from furniture departments, with purpose-designed crystal holders, silver plate ice buckets, and matching serving pieces that elevated the entire enterprise from convenient storage to deliberate display. A well-appointed bar cart communicated that the household took its entertaining seriously, that the host and hostess were people of taste who had invested in the appropriate equipment for gracious social life. The ice situation deserves special attention because it reveals the way that infrastructure constraints shaped social behaviour in ways that have entirely disappeared from the modern experience. Refrigerators in the early 1950s produced ice in aluminum ice cube trays, the kind that required a lever mechanism to release the cubes and that were slow to refreeze between uses. The quantity of ice available from a domestic refrigerator on any given evening was therefore finite and somewhat anxiously managed. Women preparing for cocktail parties bought supplemental ice from ice houses or gas stations, where block ice was crushed or chipped to order, and the management of this purchased ice, keeping it cold, preventing over-dilution from melting, ensuring sufficient supply for the evening, was a genuine logistical concern in the pre-automatic ice maker era. The silver ice bucket was thus both decorative and functional in a way that it is not today, and the quality of the ice management reflected directly on the hostess's preparation. The deviled egg in its 1950s form was a dish of considerable technical complexity, despite its humble reputation, and the women who mastered it to the standard the era demanded had developed genuine skill. The eggs had to be hard-boiled without the greenish ring that resulted from overcooking, a timing question that was less straightforward than it sounds, before the era of digital kitchen timers and universal cooking resources. The whites had to be set to exactly the right texture, firm enough to hold their shape when served but not rubbery. The yolk mixture, typically a combination of the mashed yolks with mayonnaise, mustard, a small amount of vinegar, salt and white pepper, had to be smooth enough to pipe cleanly and seasoned well enough to stand on its own as a flavour experience. The piping technique required a pastry bag and tip and a practised hand, and the final paprika garnish, applied via a small fine mesh sieve for uniform distribution, was the kind of professional detail that separated the serious entertainer from the merely adequate one. The management of conversational flow at a cocktail party had an architectural dimension that went beyond furniture arrangement. The experienced hostess understood that different kinds of conversation happened in different spatial relationships, that the intimate disclosure requiring a degree of privacy was different from the public performance of wit and charm that anchored the room's social energy, and that her furniture arrangement and her circulation management needed to accommodate both simultaneously. The alcove and the window seat created natural spaces for the quieter exchange. The area near the bar cart naturally generated the more performative conversation, as fresh drinks produced fresh animation. Reading these spatial dynamics and moving people into the right configurations without appearing to direct anything was the highest skill of the mid-century hostess, and the women who possessed it were socially invaluable and socially sought. The specific cultural status of the woman who entertained well in the 1950s was a form of social capital that translated directly into the social and professional advancement of her household. A man whose wife could produce a flawlessly managed cocktail party was a man whose career was partly managed by that wife's social competence. Business relationships were maintained and advanced through the domestic entertaining that she organised, hosted and executed. The social debt created by a superb dinner party was real currency in the professional networks of the period, and the woman who was known as an exceptional hostess was known, more broadly, as an asset to her household's social standing. This understanding was explicit, not hidden. It was discussed openly in the hosting guides and the etiquette columns that defined the standards. The domesticity was not a private retreat from the professional world. It was the professional world's social infrastructure, and the woman who ran it was doing consequential work. There is a small card printed on cream stock in a clear typewriter font that survives in a number of family archives from the early 1950s, having been distributed at various points by department store personal shopping departments, charity league orientation programs, and the occasional etiquette consultant who operated out of a suite of offices in the better American business hotels. The card is titled Standards of Dress, a reference for the correctly attired woman, and it runs to 22 numbered items. Item 7 reads, "Gloves are required for all occasions of social calling, for all public appearances before noon, for church attendance, and for any formal event regardless of season. White gloves are appropriate for formal afternoon occasions, colour-matched short gloves for general daytime use, long gloves above the elbow for formal evening only." Item 14 reads, "The hat is required for lunch in a restaurant of quality. A woman who appears hatless at a formal luncheon has communicated, unintentionally or not, a want of social awareness." These were not extreme positions in 1952. They were the mainstream. The wardrobe culture of the mid-century American upper middle class operated from a system of rules about dress that was more comprehensively codified, more specifically enforced, and more socially consequential than anything most modern observers can easily imagine. Getting dressed in the morning was not a matter of personal expression or comfort within a general range of social acceptability. It was the navigation of a dense, specific, publicly visible regulatory system, and a woman who navigated it correctly demonstrated not merely good taste but social literacy, evidence that she knew what was expected of her and had chosen to comply. The foundation of the entire sartorial system, quite literally its physical foundation, was the girdle. The mid-century girdle was a garment of significant engineering complexity, a tube of elastic woven in a specific pattern to provide graduated compression from waist to upper thigh, with hook and eye closures, garter tabs for attaching nylon stockings, boning inserts at the sides and back for additional shaping, and, in the more substantial versions, a light internal structure of lightweight steel or nylon ribs that maintained the garment's shape independent of the body's own architecture. Every woman in the post-war era who had completed her adolescence and entered adult social life was expected to wear one, and the social enforcement of this expectation was remarkable in its pervasiveness. The girdle performed two distinct functions. The first was the one explicitly advertised: the reshaping of the body's natural contours toward the idealized silhouette of the decade, smoothing the hip curve beneath the pencil skirt, flattening the lower abdomen beneath the fitted bodice, providing the smooth, uninterrupted line from waist to thigh that the decade's fashions required. The second function was more subtly social. The girdle, through its physical constriction, produced a specific quality of physical carriage, a slight stiffness of the torso, a controlled quality of movement, a restriction of the stride and the ease of sitting and rising, that communicated to observers who were practiced at reading it that the woman wearing it was making an effort. She was not at ease. She was performing her social role, and the performance cost something. The cost was visible, and it was respected. Over the girdle went the full infrastructure of 50s undergarments, the nylon stockings, which required attachment to the garter tabs, and which ran with frustrating regularity, producing the constant social anxiety of the visible run that required either a spare pair in the handbag or a graceful exit to address the problem. The full slip, in nylon or acetate, which protected the outer garment from the body's moisture and provided an additional smooth underlayer. And for the full skirt fashions that dominated daytime dressing for much of the decade, the crinoline petticoat. The crinoline was a structural garment built on stiffened nylon net in multiple layers, designed specifically to support the A-line and full-circle skirts that were the signature silhouette of the decade's daytime fashion. Without the crinoline, the skirt collapsed inward. With it, the skirt assumed the tent-like volume that gave the 50s daytime silhouette its characteristic combination of abundant fabric and defined waist. The crinoline required its own maintenance rituals. Net crinolines softened with washing and needed periodic stiffening, a process accomplished by immersing the dry garment in a solution of sugar water or in a commercial stiffening product and allowing it to dry on a form that maintained the desired volume. The petticoat wars of the mid-decade, a genuine consumer phenomenon discussed in fashion trade publications, involved the competition between can-can petticoats with multiple tiers of stiffened ruffles, simple A-line crinolines, and the horsehair canvas petticoats derived from theatrical costuming, each offering different degrees of volume, bounce, and durability. The glove culture of the 1950s was an entire sub-economy. The rules for gloves referenced in the department store card were real and socially enforced, and the variety of gloves required to comply with them was substantial. White cotton shorty gloves for informal daytime use, which were affordable and laundered well. White kidskin gloves for more formal daytime occasions, which were expensive and required the dedicated application of a leather cleaner called stain stick, before each wearing to maintain their whiteness. Longer wrist and elbow-length gloves in various colours for afternoon events, and the opera glove, extending above the elbow, for formal evening wear, which was among the most elegant and technically demanding items in any fashionable woman's wardrobe to wear correctly. The hat requirement was enforced by social observation in a way that the girdle was not. The girdle was visible only in its effects, but the hat or its absence was immediately apparent to everyone in the room. Milliners in the 1950s were genuine artisans producing work of considerable creative variety. The pillbox hat, the half hat, the beret, the cartwheel, the asymmetric sculptural hat that was architectural rather than merely decorative. All of these forms circulated through the decade with the seasonal rotation of fashion, each representing a different relationship between the woman's head and the social space she occupied. A woman who wore her hat correctly, angled to the required degree, pinned securely through the hair so that it would not shift under normal movement, positioned to enhance rather than obscure the face, had mastered a small but visible skill. The entire wardrobe system of the mid-century is now viewed predominantly through the lens of its constraints, and those constraints were real. The expense, the physical discomfort, the time required for maintenance and preparation, and the constant low-level social surveillance of whether each element was correctly managed. But the women who operated within this system also often reported experiencing it as a form of competence, a system they had mastered, whose rules they understood better than the newcomers who made mistakes, and whose demands, once met, produced a presentation of self that communicated something clear and intentional to everyone who understood the code. The perfectly turned-out 50s woman was a recognizable type, and she was recognizable precisely because the system that produced her was specific, demanding, and widely shared. The stocking situation, which seems from the modern vantage of ubiquitous pantyhose and even more ubiquitous bare legs, like a detail of minor significance, was actually one of the more psychologically consuming daily maintenance challenges of the mid-century woman's existence. Nylon stockings, which had entered the market in 1940 and been immediately interrupted by wartime nylon rationing, had returned to civilian availability after the war, but remained expensive enough relative to average incomes to constitute a real economic consideration. They ran with maddening reliability. A snag on a rough surface, a fingernail moving too quickly along the leg, the catching of the stocking on a chair was sufficient to produce the dreaded run that travelled vertically up or down, the nylon knit in a widening ladder of destroyed fabric. The management of this reality, carrying spare stockings, learning to stop a run with a drop of clear nail lacquer, knowing which activities were high risk, was a constant background concern. The construction of a proper 50s stocking was itself a feat of textile engineering. The full-fashion stocking, which was the quality standard of the period, was knit flat on a machine and then seamed up the back, producing the visible seam line that was itself an aesthetic element of the look required to run perfectly straight up the centre back of the leg. The maintenance of a straight seam line required checking every time one stood from a seated position, and the habit of reaching behind one's own leg to adjust the seam was so characteristic of the era that it functioned almost as a social marker. The circular knit seamless stocking, which would eventually displace the full fashion style, was available and affordable throughout the decade but carried a slight class stigma. It was considered less elegant, less precise, a compromise with practicality that the serious dresser was reluctant to make. The hat culture of the 1950s underwent a fascinating evolution across the decade that reflected broader shifts in the social world the hat was navigating. The early 50s hat was, in many cases, architecturally ambitious. The New Look's influence had extended to millinery as well as dress silhouette, producing hats with significant structural drama, wide brims and elaborate trimmings that required real engineering skill from the milliners who made them. By the mid-decade, as the influence of Italian and continental fashion began to make itself felt in American women's dress, the hat became smaller and more sculptural. The pillbox and its variants, which Balenciaga had been showing in Paris since the early 50s, began to appear in American ready-to-wear and, critically, at the millinery departments of American department stores in affordable versions that brought the look to a mass market. The pillbox hat required a different relationship to the head than the large-brimmed hat. It sat on top of or behind the crown, requiring careful pinning and a different hairstyle underneath to support it properly. The glove removal ceremony at a formal dinner deserves special attention as a performance of social knowledge that was rich with specific technical content. Gloves were worn to the table and removed before eating. This was universal, but the method of removal was itself prescribed. The long glove was removed from the hand not by pulling from the fingers, but by rolling it down the arm from the wrist, leaving it inside out and then folding the inverted tube back on itself to produce a neat package that could be placed in the lap or in the handbag. The shorter glove was removed by pulling the finger sections one by one until the glove came free, again inside out and folded. The gloves were never left on the table, which was considered vulgar. They were kept in the lap or the bag throughout the meal and replaced for departure. A woman who understood this ceremony and performed it smoothly was performing a piece of social knowledge as precisely as a musician performing a passage of notation, and the audience of other socially informed women at the table could evaluate the performance in real time. The ritual of the annual wardrobe review, which was conducted by socially organised women at the beginning of each fashion season, deserves acknowledgement as a significant domestic practice of the era. The review involved going through the existing wardrobe systematically and assessing each item against the current season's fashion direction, one's current social calendar, and the condition of the garment itself. Items that were out of fashion, no longer fitting, or worn beyond repair were removed. Items that needed alteration or repair were set aside for attention. Items that were appropriate and in good condition were organised by category and occasion. The review produced a list of items to be purchased in the current season to fill the gaps identified, and this list was then managed through the department store visits and catalogue orders that constituted the era's shopping infrastructure. The discipline of this practice, the regular systematic management of one's wardrobe as a professional manager's inventory, was a form of domestic competence that women of the era took seriously and that the fashion and retail industry actively encouraged. In the spring of 1941, with the United States still technically at peace, but the industrial machinery of wartime production already in accelerating motion, Elizabeth Arden delivered a commission to the United States Marine Corps, a shade of lipstick and matching nail lacquer, formulated to coordinate precisely with the new women's dress uniform. The shade was called Montezuma Red. The reasoning behind the commission was explicit and practical. The Marine Corps wanted its women volunteers to look sharp, to look unified, to look like they were part of something serious. But the cultural significance of the moment extended far beyond the specific transaction. It was the federal government of the United States officially directing its female military personnel to wear red lipstick as a component of their service dress. It was the American state formally declaring that a woman's red lip was a matter of public significance, not merely personal vanity. This moment seeded the mythology that would define red lipstick's cultural meaning for the entire post-war decade. By 1945, when the returning servicemen found their wives, sisters, and sweethearts waiting for them with red-tipped lips and carefully managed hair, the red lip had accumulated layers of meaning that went far beyond cosmetic convention. It was patriotic, it was disciplined, It was the visible evidence of a woman who had maintained her standards and her appearance through the difficulties of wartime, who had not let the absence of peacetime comfort erode her femininity or her social identity. Red lipstick was what you wore to prove that nothing had defeated you. Revlon understood this mythology completely, and their marketing through the 1950s was built on it with considerable sophistication. The company, founded in 1932 by Charles Revson and his brother Martin, along with chemist Charles Lachman, had built its initial business on nail enamel and had expanded aggressively into lipstick throughout the 40s. By the early 50s, Revlon was the dominant lipstick brand in the American mass market, and their twice-yearly lipstick launches, always accompanied by matching nail enamel, always given names that balanced glamour with just enough edge, were genuine cultural events. The 1952 launch of Fire and Ice, with its Avedon photograph of Dorian Lee in a sequined red gown and a questionnaire asking women whether they were the kind of woman who wears fire and ice, is still studied in marketing curricula as one of the most precisely targeted campaigns in advertising history. The questionnaire was the key insight. It did not tell women that Fire and Ice was for glamorous, confident, sexually self-aware women. It asked them whether they were that kind of woman, and the implicit promise of the product was that buying it confirmed that they were. The lipstick was not merely a cosmetic, it was a piece of identity documentation. You wore fire and ice because you were the woman who wore fire and ice, and wearing it produced in some small but real way the confidence and self-assertion that the name promised. This circular logic was not cynical, or not only cynical. It described a real psychological mechanism that women throughout the decade experienced and reported, that putting on red lipstick changed how one felt about oneself, not only how one appeared to others. The chemistry of the lipstick that delivered this transformation was itself a remarkable product of the mid-century industrial moment. Hazel Bishop, a genuine organic chemist who had worked at Standard Oil before pivoting to cosmetics, had introduced her no-smear lipstick in 1950, built on a bromo-acid dye system that stained the lips while the waxy carrier melted away, producing a colour that lasted through coffee and conversation and the ordinary abrasion of a normal day. The product was a sensation, and within 2 years had captured a significant share of the lipstick market, forcing Revlon and other established brands to accelerate their own longwear formulation programs. Tangy, one of the oldest American lipstick brands, which had made its reputation on a colour-reactive formula that responded to the wearer's individual pH to produce a customized pink-red, competed in a different market segment, the woman who wanted the suggestion of colour rather than its full assertion. But even Tangy's marketing leveraged the wartime patriotism of the red lip tradition. The specific shade geography of the 1950s red lip was more complex than the simple category red suggests. The early decade favoured what beauty editors called true red, a blue-based red in the classic theatrical tradition, associated with the cooler, more composed glamour of the Grace Kelly archetype. By mid-decade, orange reds had moved into fashion prominence under the influence of the Italian sun and warmth aesthetic, and Revlon's coral reef and similar warm-toned reds dominated the counter displays. By the late 50s, the influence of the Bardot aesthetic from France, a fuller, more naturally shaped mouth in softer, less assertive colour, had created a counter-movement toward pinks and near-nudes that would accelerate dramatically into the 1960s. But throughout all of these oscillations, the classic red remained the standard against which all other lipstick shades were measured, the reference point from which fashion's deviations were defined. The ritual of red lipstick application was itself a performance dense with social meaning. The compact mirror, the lipstick tube, so specifically a 50s design object, sleek, cylindrical, capped in gold or silver metal, often engraved or otherwise personalized, the careful outlining of the lip shape with the lipstick itself or with a separate lip pencil, the blotting between layers to build intensity while preventing transfer. All of this was a self-conscious act, performed with the knowledge that it was being observed, and it communicated things about the woman performing it that went beyond the simple desire for colour on her face. The pressing of the lips together after application, the gesture that spread and set the colour uniformly, was the most specific of the era's gestures, familiar from 1,000 film scenes and magazine photographs, and it communicated something precise: completion, readiness, the decision to meet the world on one's own terms. It was the period at the end of the sentence, the closing of the compact, the moment before the door opened. It was the last private act before the public performance began, and every woman who performed it understood that it was both a small thing, a cosmetic adjustment of trivial physical consequence, and a large one, the daily act of deciding who she was going to be when she walked out into her era. The red lipstick of the 1950s was armour, as the title insists, but armour is perhaps too passive a metaphor. Armour receives blows. The red lip was more aggressive than that. It was a declaration. It announced the arrival of a specific kind of woman, disciplined, aware, undefeated by the considerable demands of her historical moment, choosing beauty as a form of agency in a world that offered her limited other forms. The women who wore it knew this. That is why they kept choosing it, every morning, at every vanity table, in every house on every tree-lined street of the post-war American suburb, because putting it on was the first act of the day that was entirely, undeniably and defiantly their own. The wartime connection to red lipstick's post-war cultural power is, if anything, even more specific than the Ardennes Marine Corps Commission suggests. The psychological literature of wartime productivity had documented extensively the role of self-presentation in maintaining worker morale and efficiency, and the American government's propaganda apparatus, through the Office of War Information and its relationships with women's magazines, had actively encouraged women to maintain their grooming and appearance as a form of patriotic service. The argument was direct and was made explicitly in government-sponsored advertising throughout the war years. A woman who looked after her appearance was a woman who maintained her spirit, and a woman who maintained her spirit was a woman who could continue to do the work that the war effort required of her. Red lipstick in this context was not vanity, it was duty. The Revlon Fire and Ice campaign of 1952 was the capstone of a decade of increasingly sophisticated cosmetics advertising, and examining the specific creative decisions behind it illuminates the entire cultural logic of the red lipstick moment. Richard Avedon's photograph of Dorian Leigh was taken in a single session, with minimal retouching by the standards of the period. Leigh's beauty was genuine, her presence in the image authoritative and self-possessed in a way that could not be manufactured after the fact. The questionnaire that accompanied the advertisement, which asked potential customers to answer yes or no to a series of questions designed to identify the kind of woman who wore fire and ice, was a marketing innovation of genuine psychological sophistication. It transformed the reader from passive recipient of advertising claims into active participant in the product's meaning-making. She was not told that fire and ice was for independent, sensual, self-aware women. She was invited to assess whether she was that woman, and the product was offered as confirmation of her self-assessment. Charles Revson's personal obsession with the colour red as a commercial property was not merely intuitive, it reflected a genuine understanding of the specific cultural work that red performed in the post-war American context. Red was the colour that cut through the grey flannel of the era's corporate aesthetic, through the pastel domesticity of the suburban colour palette, through the carefully managed neutrality that women were expected to maintain in most of their social presentations. A woman in red lipstick was not neutral. She was making a visible, legible claim on the social space she occupied, and in a decade that was simultaneously expanding women's consumer power and contracting their civic and professional power, red lipstick was one of the most effective tools available for the assertion of visible selfhood. The transition away from the classic red lip that began in the late 1950s and accelerated through the early 60s was not merely a fashion shift. It was a cultural signal of considerable significance. The nude and pink lip palettes that Mary Quant and the London fashion world would promote in the early 60s represented a different relationship to feminine visibility. Where the red lip made a claim, the nude lip withdrew one. The mod girl's pale lips and heavy coal eyes redistributed the face's visual emphasis in a way that was immediately legible as a generational statement. We are not our mothers, and our mouths will not speak in the language they used. The red lipstick that the 50s woman had worn as armour was precisely what the next generation was laying down. Whether they were right to do so, and what they gained and lost in the exchange, is a question that the beauty industry and the women who participate in it are still, in various ways, working through to this day. The red lipstick's persistence as a cultural symbol long after the specific social conditions of the 1950s have changed is evidence that the original meaning was deep enough to survive the transformation of its context. Contemporary women who choose red lipstick are not for the most part consciously invoking the wartime patriotism narrative or performing the specific social signals of the mid-century. But they are drawing on a cultural archive of meaning that accumulated precisely in the decade when the red lip was most powerfully codified, and that residual meaning, authority, self-possession, the decision to be visible rather than retreating into neutrality, remains legible even when its specific historical origins are forgotten. The compact mirror clicked open on the vanity table of 1955, and the lipstick bullet emerged from its case with the same gesture that will be performed somewhere by someone tomorrow morning. The ritual continues. The armour endures,